So here today, in this particular panel, we're going to hear first of all from Melanie Judge. So I'm going to introduce Melanie first, and then the respondents in their turn. We're very lucky that Melanie's here, not least because she was stranded in Heathrow for 5 hours. We're very lucky to hear a voice from South Africa, because we've looked to South Africa quite a lot in the last decade or so as a model of how to legislatively include the voices of LGBT people. And Melanie has been very much part of that movement. She's the editor of a book on same-sex marriage campaign in that country that was a successful campaign. And the book is called To Have and to Hold, The Making of Same-Sex Marriage in South Africa. She's been involved as a human rights consultant here in this part of the world, in the Northern Hemisphere, but also in Africa and South Africa. And she's currently on the executive committee of the Coalition of African Lesbians. Really looking forward to hearing what she has to say to us today. Thank you, Melanie.
I must say that speaking after the president of a country is really a hard act to follow. And I sort of was half tempted at just standing up and saying ditto and leaving it at that. But I think I've come very far, so I'll have to share some of my thoughts. But thanks very much to LGBT Diversity and Atlantic Philanthropies for inviting me here to address you today. Interestingly enough, 40 years ago, almost to the day, I entered the world kicking and screaming right here in Dublin Fair City. I haven't stopped kicking and screaming, although the reasons for it have certainly changed. But it's a great honor to be here and to share perspectives from my work in South Africa, particularly where I've lived all my life, really. I want to start by saying that I'm aware, it was raised in the first panel, that we are holding these discussions at a critical moment in Ireland's history. The implosion of the banking sector, the contraction of the economy, and the ensuing crisis in political leadership, I think, have shaken this nation to the core. The financial bailout and the structural adjustments that lie ahead with their anticipated job cuts and obviously shrinkages in social welfare expenditure are going to impact on all aspects of Irish life. And I think importantly, as we've seen the world over, these impacts will be most acutely felt by those that are at the social and the economic margins. The rich, and I believe you have a very robust elite class here in Ireland, they are for the most part buffered from these devastating effects of fiscal austerity measures. And there's a very real danger, I think, in the name of economic pragmatism, that social and human rights gains run the risk of either being overlooked or entirely eroded. It's perhaps, as Oscar Wilde would have it, really an age of cynicism, where we know the price of everything and the value of nothing. So although this is not the focus of my presentation by any means, I absolutely want to stress as a starting point, I believe, the crucial role of human rights defenders in shaping Ireland's political and economic landscape going forward. It's just far too important to be left over to the politicians and the economists alone. But anyway, back to the task at hand. My paper really is going to draw on experiences of South African LGBTI organizations and social justice movements. And I think in doing so, what I'm hoping to do is to raise some considerations for your own deliberations in strengthening collaborations here in Ireland, particularly in supporting and growing lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender communities. Before I begin, I want to ensure myself against any later claims of not having provided strict answers to the questions of the day. And I want to quote one of my favorite philosophers, Sven Lindqvist. He's a Swedish man who said, "You already know enough, so do I. It is not knowledge we lack. What is missing is the courage to understand what we know and to draw conclusions." And indeed, I think it's the conclusions that we draw that are going to shape the ways of working together. But let me start with a little bit about the context that I come from. The South African Constitution, as we all know, is a social contract born out of the democratic struggle against both apartheid and colonialism. It embodies the foundational values of a new society, and those values are human dignity, equality, and the advancement of human freedom. The historic equality clause, which is in the Bill of Rights of our Constitution, asserts the right to non-discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. This constitutional protection set the stage for precedent-setting jurisprudence on gay and lesbian rights in South Africa, certainly in post-apartheid South Africa. And the litigation process that followed, that was primarily led by LGBT organizations, sought to challenge laws, apartheid laws, that had criminalized lesbian and gay sexualities and relationships. And so what we saw is that over a period of a decade, after the enactment of our constitution, a number of victories were won in the courts. And these victories extended a range of legal benefits and protections to same-sex couples. And included amongst those are, as you probably know, immigration rights, pension benefits, and joint adoption rights. These incremental legal gains paved the way for the very historic passing of the Civil Union Act in 2006, which provides full marriage rights to same-sex couples in South Africa. So post-apartheid South Africa drove its social change agenda through law and policy. And as a result, we have a remarkable raft of legislation in support of human rights. But despite this, South Africa remains a deeply divided and prejudiced society. Growing poverty and inequality, coupled with a violent intolerance for difference, is a lethal cocktail for all those in our society who are perceived as other. Foreign nationals, lesbian women, gay men, transgender people, and people living with HIV and AIDS are some of the groups that are at risk to be targeted for prejudice-motivated hate crimes. And in South Africa, these hate crimes occur in the context of a formal economy which excludes the majority of the population. On top of that, if that's not enough, South Africa is a highly patriarchal society. Gender-based violence, including the rape and murder of lesbian and gay people in our townships, is one of the ways in which heteronormative genders and sexualities are maintained. A recent study indicated just how homo-prejudiced the South African psyche is. It estimated in that study that 80% of people believe that same-sex sexualities are totally unacceptable. That said, turning to Ireland, it's very clear to me that there have been great strides made in this country in developing equality protections for LGBT people in the area of education, employment, health and welfare. I'm aware also that in addition, the strategic lobbying efforts of many of the organizations in this room have yielded very important policy responses that now facilitate access to services that are more responsive to LGBT needs. I think these are key strategies to create a more inclusive society. I'm also very impressed to see that LGBT organizations have amassed rich research and documentation on the challenges you still face. And I think that these offer a very solid grounding for your continued public education and consciousness-raising activities. Also notably, working alongside supportive state actors and statutory bodies, you've made incredible strides in putting the LGBT agenda on the country's agenda. And certainly we, and I particularly, have much to learn from you on that score. I also see, and I've had the pleasure of meeting back home a year ago, a group from your very sophisticated, vibrant and articulate LGBT community, particularly the young up-and-coming leaders. So for those of you who are a bit greying in the audience, I think you needn't worry. Your future appears to be in quite powerful hands. I think that growing this community and expanding its reach, and very importantly its diversity, will certainly support further inroads to equality in both the public and the private spheres. The recent passing of civil partnership legislation in Ireland, I think, is an important milestone on the road to legal parity for same-sex relationships. However, it appears to me that the job is unfinished. The right to co-parent and raise families in same-sex households cuts to the heart of the right to dignity and sexual and reproductive autonomy. Equality just doesn't exist in half measures. What is heartening, though, is that the Irish public appears to be largely supportive of LGBT rights, as recent polls have indicated. And I think this provides a very strong platform for deepening the inclusion of LGBTs in all facets of Irish society. In both South Africa and Ireland, homophobia has been fueled through religious discourses. Denying the right of those who are perceived to be morally wrong is linked to this belief that religious values are the core of a stable society. But the problem with morality, of course, is that it's entirely relative. Whose morality counts, when and how. So it cannot go unchallenged that religious bodies in Ireland appear to be exempt from key pieces of equality legislation. This amounts to state sanction for religious prejudice. In South Africa, LGBT organizations work with progressive communities of faith to challenge dominant perceptions of homosexuality. We do this because we are confident that when religious convictions speak out against systems of oppression, they become an unstoppable force for progressive social change. LGBTs the world over are a microcosm of the societies in which they are located and which they wish to transform in some way. And so as such, our LGBT movements are themselves a site of struggle. We bring our own racial, gender, and sexual politics to the work we do. At the core of collaboration is the imperative to change the way that power operates in society, but also how power plays itself out in our ranks. And so change always starts within. I think for some of us, this will mean relinquishing oppressive power. Others of us will be called on to assume power in shared and affirming ways. I think James Joyce summed it up neatly in Ulysses when he said, "Be just before you are generous." Of course, with any collaboration, the priorities and the plans need to be carefully strategized and the systems put in place to support their implementation. But at the end of the day, the collective energy to act doesn't jump off the page of a plan. It comes from a commitment to the idea that what we are trying to achieve relies on our interdependence and on an ethic of mutuality. My own politics has been greatly transformed through working alongside other actors and activists who differ from me. They've stretched my thinking and forced me to examine my own prejudices and privileges. In LGBT communities, as was discussed in this morning's panel, the fault lines of urban, rural, age, class, race, and gender exist. Ironically, across these spatial and structural divides, discrimination remains a shared currency. The L, the G, the B, the T, and the I are intersecting, but they each have distinct experiences of marginalization. And I think that our work needs to be alive and responsive to this. Also, of course, we are not only LGBTI. We have many social identities. We may be young, we may be old, we may be men, women, urban or rural-based, rich or poor. And I think that recognizing and working with these multiple identities is vital to this process of sector building. In order to establish enduring collaborations, we've learned in South Africa that right at the outset, there's a need to identify the foundational values on which our coming together will be based. I think that these values set the parameters for why and of course, how organizations are going to be working together. They, in a sense, are the scaffolding for our collective work. They're the lifeblood of our collaboration. These values, which need to be carefully crafted and clearly articulated, enable diverse groups to convene around a shared strategy. Then, of course, moving collaboration into action requires a mix of strategies that will enable individual organizations to work on issues that best fit with their philosophies, ethos, and strengths. Strong movements are able to hold together a collection of different tones and different approaches to activism. And I think that this mix provides a richness and allows for a fuller spectrum of perspectives to shape what I hope will be a common agenda. The alliances formed amongst South African LGBT organizations have been cemented through very issue-based campaigns around which we have launched specific programs of action, for example, anti-hate crime campaigns and more recently the same-sex marriage campaign. I think that importantly, by joining forces as organizations and by being both visible and vocal, we offer a very powerful resistance against oppressive gender and sexual systems. The work we do together creates greater pockets of belonging in contexts that still remain predominantly hostile to LGBTs. In South Africa, striving for LGBT equality is integrally linked with the broader aim of transforming a society and the need to make good on our constitutional promises. Therefore, one question we've had to ask is how do we advance our activism beyond the confines of the LGBT community? LGBT organizations at home increasingly locate their work within growing movements for social and economic justice. This takes the form of joint programs with other marginalized groups, such as sex workers, immigrants, people living with HIV and AIDS, and others. In an increasingly globalized world, and with the help of technology, I think that we can forge alliances across sectors, across issues, and across borders. And I think on this point, I'm particularly pleased to see other human rights organizations represented here today. It's absolutely clear that our struggles are entirely indivisible. Here in Ireland, I'm aware that discrimination persists for women, for ethnic minorities, such as travellers, for single parents, immigrants, the disabled, and others. Prejudice, of course, as we know, can heighten in times of economic uncertainty, when people may start to express legitimate frustrations through scapegoating already stigmatized groups. We cannot lose sight of the fact, and it was said earlier this morning, I'm pleased to say, that equality and dignity are not luxury items to be expended when the material going gets tough. They should and must be at the centre of any economic recovery plan. Recent spending cuts to key state institutions dealing with equality in Ireland might negatively impact the extent to which these issues are considered in political decision-making. It's often mooted that in times of financial crisis, our issues are simply not a priority. But we need to ensure that our voices shape the very solutions we're looking for, as these solutions will have the greatest impact on those at our margins. As in South Africa, I'm aware that LGBT people in Ireland experience a range of discrimination, and that these are exacerbated when there's an absence of services in local areas. The urban-rural divide, which Breda spoke about so eloquently this morning, so often invisibilizes where the needs are the greatest in our communities. And so urban-based organizations, I believe, are very well placed to support emerging LGBT communities in rural areas and to take those issues to the policy table. This requires setting up open rather than closed systems that consult and collaborate with and in local communities. The work of urban organizations should be moored in the most pressing issues facing communities, and should also, as part of their work, bring these communities closer to the centers of political action and political power. When people become active in their own neighborhoods, they become a potent force for dealing with local problems. And active citizenry, of course, is core to a vibrant democracy. Financially sustaining non-profit organizations, especially in the present economic crisis, is a massive challenge. The reality check is that LGBT activism requires resources. So funders need to recognize that building an inclusive and a participatory democracy is as important as resourcing service delivery. Private investment, and here I include from well-resourced LGBT communities, because I think there's still well-resourced LGBT communities out there, are important sources of financing for an independent LGBT sector, and I underlined independent here. It's my hope that LGBT diversity and its partners will be able to raise local resources for the critical job that lies ahead in supporting and strengthening your communities. Kader Asmal, who's one of my favourite ANC politicians, and I don't have many favourite ANC politicians anymore, they're too disastrous for words at the moment, but anyway, he's an ANC stalwart who spent, I think, about 25 or 30 years in Ireland, and he wisely said quite recently, and I quote, "Human rights are never static, they are always dynamic. They are never completely won, just as they are never completely lost." Equality before the law carries immense practical and symbolic significance. It also creates a more inclusive society and facilitates increased LGBT visibility and voice. The law on its own will not eliminate stereotyping and prejudice. However, it can be a powerful vehicle to change social norms, to hold leaders to account, and to protect from discrimination. However, the legal victories we celebrate are incomplete, they are conditional, and they're tenuous. The challenge, I believe, is to build a strong and enduring LGBT social movement. Such a movement is what it will take to successfully advance and defend the gains made to date. And I think this is a reality for LGBT struggles across the globe. But a mass-based LGBT movement that intersects with other movements for social justice is just a romantic idea. And if there are convergences in struggles against racism, against homophobia, against women's oppression, can we find ways to articulate these through collective action? These are critical questions for global human rights efforts. Collective political action must, in my opinion, open up new possibilities. Possibilities that are unimaginable if we remain over-invested in rigid identity-defined strategies. We, and by we here I mean it in a very expansive sense, I mean all human rights and social justice defenders, we are well positioned to mobilize diverse communities across the multiple exclusions that people continue to face and that I dare say will deepen in this country, be that because of their gender, their sexuality, their location, their class, their land of origin, or the colour of their skin. Frantz Fanon talks about the building of imagined communities. I think it's a wonderful image. Imagined communities are ultimately based not on similarity, but on solidarity. From this perspective, groups don't disappear, but the boundaries that distinguish them become just that little bit more porous. And I think that fluid boundaries would enable those that we may perceive as other to be drawn into our struggles as allies. I want to draw to a close with the words of Justice Ailbhe Sachs, and they were uttered in his historic judgment on same-sex marriage in South Africa. I think it speaks to the role for each of us in shaping the character of a nation, because I think that's the task that lies ahead. And I quote, "What is at stake is not simply a question of removing an injustice experienced by a particular section of a community. At issue is a need to affirm the very character of our society as one based on tolerance and mutual respect. The test of tolerance is not how one finds space for people with whom and practices with which one feels comfortable, but how one accommodates the expression of what is discomforting. As a feminist, I'm of the opinion that the elimination of homophobia is inextricably linked to ending gender, racial, and economic inequality. I also believe that LGBT liberation requires that we redefine masculinity and femininity, that we contest the meaning of family and normative gender roles, and that we challenge dominant views about sexual and reproductive choices. And what better people than the queers to affirm both the right to sameness and the freedom of difference. I'm equally adamant, so you can relax, that reconstructing society in this way enriches and grows every single one of us, gay, straight, everyone in between and beyond. It's a mighty task. Let's get to it.